Good morning. Okay, you can hear me. I can hear the echo in my head. Anyway, just a moment of context or background on this project. The paper I'm giving you is it will be a small piece out of a larger project, and I'm basically a South Asianist who's done field work on India before this and very happily wandered into the world of intentional community studies. And so I finished a book called Growing Stories from India, Religion and the Fate of Agriculture. And what that book did was look at how can we tell different stories, narratives, and metaphors about how we feed the world in ways that are just to all members of the bio community, people, and the earth. And where that got me really interested was, okay, if we get these great values of nonviolence, for example, voluntary simplicity, how do we do these things? How are these things actually translated into practice in very small contexts? And I figured what better place to look at this would be in intentional communities. And so that is in brief, that is my journey into this paper. So be the change. It's a phrase that is commonly attributed to Mohandas K. Gandhi. This phrase has been ubiquitous among communities and individuals seeking social change. Today, Gandhi's views on nonviolence, democracy, and self-sufficiency, they provide a paradigm to confront contemporary social and environmental crises around food and agriculture. Several years ago, I started visiting intentional communities in the United States to answer two primary questions. First, how can Gandhi help us in the United States address contemporary crises? And second, what are the practical implications of translating abstract values such as self-sufficiency, nonviolence, and public service into actual practice? So to answer these questions, I sought out a set of intentional communities that first draw upon Gandhi's thought, whether explicitly or implicitly. Second, they understand themselves to be experimental communities. And third, and most important, that enact change in their larger communities. Now, none of these groups are explicitly Gandhian, and nor would either they or I say they have an exact, they would venture to make claims regarding the authenticity of their translation of Gandhian thought. However, as I visited these different communities in the United States, I've seen that there's a raft of values associated with Gandhi, including nonviolent communication, appropriate technologies, voluntary simplicity, and self-sufficiency. And these values provide a vocabulary to reconsider and perhaps even resist our increasingly individualistic and commercialized society. So why Gandhi and why today? Almost a century ago, Gandhi, who's also known by his honorific title Mahatma, or the Great Soul One, he prescribed a paradigm for democracy that bundled concepts such as self-sufficiency, nonviolence, equity, voluntary simplicity. Gandhi drew upon both Hindu and Western thought, and he forged his ideas in the crucible of the struggle for Indian independence. However, his words anticipate contemporary debates about food, governance, and sustainability in the early years of the 21st century. For those seeking social change, Gandhi has become an iconic figure for nonviolent resistance to social, economic, and now environmental injustices, and for those seeking democratic control of resources. We in the United States face a number of challenges, including hyper-individualism and overconsumption. And the U.S., as probably a number of you know, we're deeply divided across partisan lines, almost to the point of being dysfunctional. Look at our Congress. Gandhi, however, tends to be admired across partisan lines, and the constellation of values associated with him are potential points of dialogue across broad lines. And I want to point out a caveat here that the way we in the United States understand and receive Gandhi is certainly not a range of political and social differences between how we work with Gandhi in the U.S. versus India. So I would not necessarily make these same claims about how Gandhi is understood in India. But communities that practice values such as nonviolence, self-sufficiency, voluntary simplicity, they exemplify the quotation that is popularly attributed to Gandhi. Be the change you want to see in the world. And in my visits to a number of these communities, I frequently saw this phrase painted on walls, written in promotional literature, and it's virtually certain that Gandhi never actually said those words. In fact, no one really knows where it came from. Nonetheless, be the change to become a mantra for those seeking social change and alternate ways of living in the United States. So, onto the communities. Over the past several years, I've been visiting communities that demonstrate how we translate these values into practice. And so today, I'm going to talk about the Possibility Alliance, Dancing Rabbit Eco Village, and several Catholic worker houses and farms, mostly located in rural northeast Missouri, which is a place that most people would not automatically associate with communal living. And so why northeast Missouri, which is extremely rural and actually fairly hard to get to? All of the communities I looked at have a large range of members from a broad geographic distribution, certainly across the United States and somewhat abroad, so these are not regional movements. But again, why Missouri? Missouri basically has fairly few rules around building and even food. So communities that want to try building techniques, try things that are illegal for a lot of us, for example, water reclamation techniques, which violates building codes, it's a great place to go. It also has fairly inexpensive and arable land, unlike its neighbors to the north, say Iowa, which is flat, and the big agribusiness has taken that over. Another important factor for communities, particularly those who want to do food things, there's a large presence of Amish and Mennonite communities, and so there's a certain amount of knowledge about traditional farming techniques as well as tools and older forms of machinery that can help provide a certain amount of structure. So the Possibility Alliance. So the Possibility Alliance. Ethan and Sarah Hughes founded the Possibility Alliance in 2007, and they purchased an existing Mennonite homestead. Some of the criteria they had were that it be near an existing railway or Amtrak station, be close to Mennonite and Amish communities, and have good arable land. Because they bought this existing homestead, they've been able to focus on food and agriculture rather than building infrastructure. And so they've been able to grow most of the food they eat, although they do trade with local communities as well as get gifts from families, and friends and family. Since their arrival, like-minded groups, families, and others have purchased land nearby, and so their affiliated community has grown. So in the Possibility Alliance itself, this past summer, they had about 12 full-time residents. During the summer, when they have a number of interns and other exchange students, it basically triples in population, and the local community has grown in size as well. In the Possibility Alliance, officially it's non-denominational, but it has a very strong Quaker flavor. They hold a Friday night Seder, and they also hold a Quaker meeting on Sunday morning. Ethan and Sarah Hughes, they specifically articulate their vision in terms of Gandhian values, again, nonviolence, appropriate technology, self-sufficiency. As part of their practice, they abstain from using fossil fuels and electricity, both for environmental reasons and also because of the economic and political violence that's associated with those production systems, particularly in the global south. They have a garage full of bicycles and trailers that are for use for residents and others. For a long distance travel, they use Amtrak. And just as the issue on the they're very well aware that Amtrak, for example, their bicycles have embedded energy. So as I worked along the interns and also in later interviews with them, all of them really emphasized the primacy of nonviolent communications, interpersonal relationships, and inner transformation. And in these conversations, talking with them, it helped me realize how important some of these values associated with Gandhi were. So concepts, for example, sustainability, nonviolence, participatory democracy were all very much linked. And so in these discussions, a nonviolent food system, for example, must include food democracy, democratic decisions about what kind of food we eat, as well as the mode of production. And another point that they brought out, which I thought was very important, was discussions about food and violence, for example, have to move beyond simply organics and vegetarianism, and also include less frequently recognized aspects of political economy. For example, how do we produce chocolate? How do we produce coffee? Both of which are often producing very environmentally unsustainable as well as inequitable systems. A few slides here. Poster of Gandhi. Here's some of the bicycles they used to grind their grain. Their wood stove, again, they don't use electricity. This is their outdoor kitchen. It's actually very pretty. It's a cob oven. It's surrounded by their gardens. If you live here in the summer, this is where you'll live. That is the wheel of nonviolence that I've seen up in a number of different places. That's their calendar of stuff. Okay, on to Dancing Rabbit. So, Dancing Rabbit and their neighboring communities, Sandhill Farm and Red Earth, they're about 40 miles north of the Possibility Alliance. In 1993, 3 Stanford students crafted a plan to build an eco-village from the ground up. And so a lot of Dancing Rabbit's energy has gone into building their, into alternative building techniques and actually building their infrastructure that exists today. A couple slides here of this. That's actually what they call one of their failed projects, they call it. It's a green roof that sort of collapsed. That's during some of our little work programs, that's us learning some plastering techniques. And one thing I learned, and I've seen echoed here, is when you go to volunteer places like this, even though I go offering skills, I realize I have a lot more to learn than I can actually offer. More of a hindrance than a help. Looking confused. That actually you can't see, that's an old school bus. We took a school bus and then they built a berm, they put solar panels on it, and now it's actually quite a nice little house. But Dancing Rabbit has a really interesting range of different sorts of alternate building techniques. And again, back to the building code, you can sort of do what you want there in Missouri, which is a benefit. Here is, that's one of the cooking co-ops, and that is a car topper roof, so if you recognize from the back of a pickup truck, there it is. Okay, that is next. Okay, so before breaking ground, the 3 founders, they created a consensus-based system of governance, again based on principles of nonviolent communications. And so everyone who goes, becomes a member eventually of Dancing Rabbit goes through some training in nonviolent communication during the 3-week-long visitors program, but what I've noticed is a lot of the members explicitly seek out much more advanced training. So a lot of people are working on restorative justice circles, for example. In 2012, Dancing Rabbit had about 70 members, plus short-term residents, work exchange students, summer interns in the summer. And the best way to describe it is a community of communities. And so all these smaller communities, they form according to shared views on income, food, and building techniques. So for example, one of these communities is income sharing. Most of the smaller communities coalesce around their food and cooking preferences. And so at Dancing Rabbit, there's not one generalizable eating style, but it's really according to the cooking, the individual cook group preferences. The larger Dancing Rabbit community has 6 ecological covenants. For example, no one may own an individual vehicle, all building materials must be either repurposed or locally sourced, and all agriculture on the land must be organic. And so these rules are fairly flexible. They provide for some discussion and debate, but it does help avoid the imposition of a strict ideology. And the system of multiple cooking groups and communities, I think, offers them a lot of resilience because a lot of the major decisions are made within smaller groups and not among the larger communities. So a lot of potential conflicts are resolved in smaller groups and don't really have to involve the larger community. And again, both of them, Dancing Rabbit and Possibility Alliance, stress their experimental nature, that no one has all the answers. They're demonstrating, they're trying things. And I think their ability to accommodate a large range of ideas and behaviors is one important aspect of nonviolence. So on to some of the Catholic worker houses that I visited. This picture here is the Cherith Brook Catholic Worker House. It's in a fairly urban, it's an urban area in Kansas City, Missouri, and it's a fairly rough neighborhood. I mean, that house actually looks pretty nice, but the neighborhood itself is fairly rough. I visited a number of these Catholic worker houses and farms. Tim Miller had presented some of the background, so I'm not going to go into the background of the Catholic Worker House, but in brief, Dorothy Day and Peter Morin founded the Catholic Worker Movement in response to the poverty of the Great Depression. And these worker houses and farms, they emphasize voluntary simplicity, hospitality, self-sufficiency, and non-violence. And one of the important points is this movement is it's anarchic. So each house and farm is different. There's not one large rule that governs all of them. And so Cherith Brook Catholic Worker House in Kansas City, it has a very extensive chicken and garden program that contributes towards our hospitality mission. And so the eggs go to feeding people breakfast in the morning. They also have a fairly unique service too. In addition to feeding people breakfast in the morning, they have a shower mission. So they allow people to come in, take showers, get a fresh set of clothes from their clothes. They have a fairly large, extensive clothes closet. Let people take full showers individually, get whatever toiletries and this and that they need, and then they go off and do whatever they need to for the day. So jumping on to Gainesville, Florida, which is where I'm from, the Catholic Worker House in Gainesville, Florida, they open their home to mostly homeless people, but anyone in need, and serve organic food. And most of the people they serve food to live in Gainesville's tent city. In Florida, we're a warm place, and a lot of our homeless live in tents just a little bit outside of the city. Most of the food that the Gainesville Catholic Worker House serves is locally sourced. A lot of it is from their own garden. And the leaders of this group, like all Catholic workers, they practice an ethic of care and justice that's informed by Catholic social thought. And so the group in Gainesville, what they do is they offer sit-down shared meals, complete with cloth tablecloths, candles. It's a very nice environment. And they provide their guests, again, typically homeless, a measure of dignity and respect that is not present often in their daily lives. One of the obvious critiques of intentional communities, particularly the rural communities in the United States, is the lack of race and class diversity. And so it's not surprising that the white middle class is very well represented in these populations. But urban organizations such as the Cherith Brook or our organization in Gainesville, Florida, they're a little bit more likely to bring in different demographics, whether it's residents or partners in some capacity. And so in Gainesville, for example, when they hold their monthly roundtable workshops and potlucks, they facilitate dialogue among populations and don't often interact. And a number of these Catholic worker houses bring the rural into the urban in the form of raised bed gardens or chickens, for example, and they often teach traditional skills in addition to their hospitality programs. And so that, teaching canning, for example, or farming techniques. And so that also is an opportunity to take the new food movement, which is often associated with the white middle class, into a larger population. So my interest is in food and agriculture, and some of the questions are how do we translate nonviolence? So I want to talk a little about how we do this in the context of food, and particularly meat. So how do we think about food and nonviolence and translate this concept into practice? After all, eating is violent. Something must die so we can eat. The Sanskrit word ahimsa, which translates as no harm, implies abstaining from harmful action, meaning that we should eat, breathe, and work, for example, in ways that bring minimal harm to other beings. And so what this means is nonviolence is not withdrawal from action, but actually a very conscious moving towards something, trying to figure out how we do things in a nonviolent way, not simply not doing something. And discussions about what we should eat reflect cultural and religious norms, and so the communities I've looked at, they think about their criteria within the social, economic, culture, and religious context. And so my questions are, how do you translate these values in their particular context? So a number of discussions about food and violence center on meat. So I'm going to look a little more deeply into the role of eating meat and how they think about it in these particular communities. So residents of the Possibility Alliance in Dancing Rabbit, they typically only eat meat in what they perceive as to be raised in a humane fashion. And so this stance reflects the choice of a very small but growing population of North Americans who base their meat choices on how the animal is raised and slaughtered. And they look at humanely raised meat, or at least hunted meat, as a less violent, possibly even humane choice. And so the term we often use is, I only eat happy chicken. Chicken is raised in a nice way. Obviously, people may have different views on this. And if I talk about this concept of happy chicken to people from the Brahma Vision Mandir ashram, which is a Gandhi ashram in India, of course, they would be horrified by the fact that you would consider eating meat could be nonviolent. So again, it's very contextual. Again, many residents of Dancing Rabbits and Possibility Alliance, if they are not vegetarians, they'll eat only meat that's locally raised, and also reflecting emphasis on local economies and bioregionalism. The Catholic worker houses I visited had somewhat of a different perspective on this. They also shared these concerns about meat and its production, but they also have to think about this in the context of one of their larger missions, which is hospitality to the poor. So the Catholic workers must also practice compassion for the very different kinds of needs of the diverse populations that they serve. The Gainesville Catholic Workers House only serves vegetarian meals. They can't afford to serve their populations locally raised organic meats, and at the same time they reject the violence associated with factory farms. And although a few of their guests might sort of grumble at vegetarian meals being sort of so-called imposed upon them, we have a lot of options in Gainesville for feeding the homeless. You have many options. You don't have just simply one place. So basically, anyone who shows up at the Gainesville Catholic Workers has chosen that particular meal. So it's not necessarily imposing anything, and if people want meat, they can go get it. It's a very different experience in Sheriff Brook Catholic Workers House. There are far fewer options for homeless people to get fed, and so they do serve meat to their guests. And my conversations with residents showed that they had somewhat of a different perspective on the issue of meat there. A number of their guests who show up there, they want meat. A number of the homeless people who come there, they see meat as a luxury food, as a kind of a rich person's food. And if they're served vegetarian food, they think they're getting sort of either the dregs or something. You know, why are we being served poor person's food? And what they really appreciate is the opportunity, and somewhat rare for them, to have what they perceive as a very nice, typical American meal, which would be something involving meat. And for many of the people who volunteer or live at this Catholic worker, even they themselves are often vegetarian and would like to eat vegetarian meals. The response of the guests when they eat vegetarian meals is, "Oh, isn't this food good enough for you? You know, you have to eat vegetarian. You can't eat the same as we do." So the meat choices bring a different type level of conflict in there. So in both cases, the Catholic workers have to balance, in these houses, have to balance their compassion towards animals with their compassion towards the physical and the emotional needs of their guests. And so again, meat is only one lens on the relationship between food and violence. The communities I've studied reflect Gandhi's understanding that centralization is a form of violence, something that you can really see in our very depopulated and depleted rural areas. All of the communities I visited are experimenting with nonviolent alternatives to the industrial food system by creating seed banks, diversifying their local food economies, and establishing measures of regional self-sufficiency. Just a little note on community reskilling and resilience. What these folks are doing, this is not a nostalgia for some kind of pre-modern utopia, and they're not trying to reclaim some modern past. All of these communities are experimenting and rethinking traditional skills, canning, for example, alternative farming techniques, in the context of contemporary needs and resources. So enhancing regional food self-sufficiencies, like we're doing in Alachua County, Florida, which is where I live, does not mean replicating inequitable social agricultural patterns of old Florida. And if you know much about old Florida, it was a very hostile environment to different sorts of populations in the past. So these communities, this is not a one-way ticket to a low-tech past, as some critics have suggested, but it's a very conscious means to rethink, you know, why do we need certain technologies, who do they really benefit? So Dancing Rabbit, for example, uses wind turbines. They're rethinking traditional skills, but they're also using these wind turbines to power up the internet and engage with the broader world. So where do we go from here? Our religious traditions address greed and violence. So think about the Bhagavad Gita and the Sermon on the Mount. In the United States, however, right-wing or evangelical appropriation of terms such as family values or even morality, and a very extreme emphasis on the individual, it's made it difficult to think about things like financial inequity, environmental degradation, and other violent practices as moral or even religious issues. A number of the people I spoke to in these communities identified as either secular or that very nebulous spiritual category, and if they're a Christian, they identified with groups such as Quakers, Catholic workers, or even the Radical Jesus movement, which is somewhat left on the left side. For residents of these intentional communities in the United States, Gandhian social thought, whether directly associated with Gandhi or not, it provides a non-religious and maybe even somewhat ecumenical discourse to think about food and other practices in a moral framework. In particular, Gandhi's emphasis on nonviolence and service has given these communities a set of tools, practices, and processes to help them think through the balance between community service and the integrity of the individual. And so few people, probably even including myself, are likely to pick up and move to intentional community, whether it's urban or rural, although many of us would like to bring the benefits home to our home communities. However, multiple scholars and community residents have claimed that as test sites or social labs, they can stimulate our imaginations of the way things could be and possibly should be. And so these small cohesive communities provide a lens into the performance of social change, and their experiments help us imagine and think through alternatives. Further, the consensus process demonstrates that trade-offs, negotiations, and compromises necessary to translate abstract values into specific practices, including governance, food, structures, and communications. And so all of these groups that I've talked about are practicing one of the most famous misattributes ever: be the change you want to see in the world.